Okay, so imagine yourself. You're sitting there, right, at this big table in like the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, right? It's opulent and everything, but like you're about to sign this document. This paper is going to redraw the map of Europe. Your nation's fate is kind of hanging in the balance. That's got to be heavy, right? And that's what these German officials, that's what they were facing at the Treaty of Versailles. It was like the end of World War I. And today, well, we go past those headlines, the ones everyone knows. We'll look at some of those stories that don't get told as much. The human side of it all, especially in those final days of the war and how those choices they made back then, well, they echoed for decades, didn't they?
It's true. It's a time that often gets overshadowed, you know?
Mm.
Like the sheer scale of the battles, it's all anyone talks about. But those last few months, and then trying to make peace, hugely important, really set the stage for, well, so much of what happened in the 20th century.
All right, so let's jump in. But before we get to Versailles, we got to set the scene. We got to talk about the 100 Days Offensive, that final push by the Allies. Huge undertaking, right? Multinational effort. But I was reading, and it sounds like it wasn't all, smooth sailing, especially when it came to us, to America getting involved.
You know, what's really interesting about all this is it shows just how complex these coalition wars are. Every nation, they brought their own baggage, right? Their experience, their priorities, even their personalities. And sometimes, yeah, those things clash. You
Yeah.
had Allied commanders. These guys were seasoned. They'd been in the trenches for years, brutal fighting. And they wanted to, well, they wanted to fit those fresh American troops into their way of doing things. But General Pershing, the guy leading the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, he had a different idea, a whole different vision.
Oh, yeah, Blackjack Pershing.
Hmm.
He was determined to make a name for America, have a separate fighting force.
Yeah.
And he knew the cost, the lives it was taking. He wanted America's role. He wanted it recognized.
Exactly. Pershing felt like the Allies, especially the French, they just didn't get it. Didn't grasp what America was bringing. Manpower, resources, the whole deal. And it all came to a head, almost boiled over at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Pershing nearly had it out with the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau. The Tiger, they called him. Tough guy, determined. Led France through some of the worst of it. And while he had strong opinions on how the war should end.
So wait, this clash at Saint-Mihiel, you're saying personalities almost derailed the whole offensive. It's wild how, personal stuff can change history.
No doubt. It just goes to show how hard it is to run a war that big, so many national interests all pulling in different directions. But the Americans, they went on to lead the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Big battle, really important in the 100 Days push. But we got to remember there were other victories, too. Ones that, maybe don't get as much attention in the history books.
Like the Blancmont Ridge. Gotta be honest, I didn't know much about that one until I started prepping for our deep dive here.
Oh, the Blancmont Ridge, now that was something. A real victory, led by U.S. Marine Major General John Lejeune. Some folks, they consider it one of the most brilliant tactical wins of the entire war, and yet it's often forgotten.
Why's that? Why doesn't that victory get the recognition it deserves?
Well, there's a couple reasons, I think. Firstly, Lejeune, he was fighting under the French Fourth Army, so not directly under Pershing. And maybe more importantly, his tactics, they were like the opposite of what Pershing wanted.
Wait, so even within the American forces, there were disagreements on how to fight the war?
You got it. It wasn't this unified front, not at all. Lejeune, he was all about those artillery barrages. Soften up the enemy defenses. Pershing thought that was like a crutch. He wanted to rely on the riflemen, on those infantry assaults, the old way of doing things.
Wow. Makes you realize even within one country's military, you got these different schools of thought, different ways of trying to win.
Yeah, and that brings up a really important point for anyone who's into history. We got to look past those big narratives, Beyond the famous names, the big battles. There are always different sides to the story, different ways to see things. And those stories are just waiting for someone to find them.
Speaking of different perspectives, when I was doing my research, something that really got to me was the role of Native American soldiers in World War I. And I'm not just talking about the code talkers, though. That's amazing, too.
Yeah.
But just their presence and the traditions they brought to the battlefield.
Oh, absolutely. Native Americans, they served in huge numbers, often dealing with discrimination, prejudice, the whole 9 yards. And yet their stories, they're so often left out. They volunteered as soldiers, scouts, support staff, and they brought their culture with them, adapted their warrior traditions to this modern battlefield. Fascinating stuff.
It makes you wonder how many other stories are out there, just waiting to be told. But for now, we should probably shift gears. Let's talk about the Armistice, the agreement that finally stopped the fighting. We use the words armistice and peace treaty a lot. Like, they're the same thing, but,
But they're different, right?
oh, for sure. An armistice, it's basically a ceasefire. Both sides agree to stop shooting. Doesn't solve the problems that started the war, but it gives everyone a chance to, well, to try to work things out. Talk about making peace.
It's like a good modern example would be the Korean War, right? The fighting stopped back in '53 with an armistice, but technically, North and South Korea, they're still at war, even today.
Exactly, and that's the thing with armistices. They can be a step towards peace, a good thing. But if you don't fix the underlying problems, things can flare up again, easily.
So with World War I, what made Germany decide, okay, we've got to get an armistice? Like, what led them to that point? Well, by late 1918, things were really bad for Germany. Years of fighting, they were worn down, resources were gone, soldiers were tired, demoralized. And the Allies, they have the Americans now, fresh troops, they were pushing hard on every front. But there's another big piece of the puzzle. Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points.
Oh yeah, Wilson's vision for a new world, how things should be.
Right. He announced them in January of '18, a plan for a lasting peace, a fair peace. He wanted to get at the root causes of the war, make sure it didn't happen again. And importantly, it gave Germany a way out, a way to end the war without being totally humiliated, totally punished.
So you're saying Wilson, his idealism, this idea of a world without war, it actually helped end the fighting. But things didn't exactly go to plan, did they?
Well, that's where peace negotiations get tricky. Germany, they were ready to talk, ready to work things out based on what Wilson said, those 14 points. But the other allies, France and Great Britain, they had different ideas. Yeah, they'd been through it, 4 years of brutal fighting, seen things most people can't even imagine, lost so many people. It's understandable they wanted payback, wanted justice, and they wanted to be sure, absolutely sure, that Germany would never be a threat again, not to Europe, not to anyone.
I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? Human nature, right? You go through that much loss, you want someone to pay, but could that need for revenge, could that have actually made real peace impossible?
It's a question historians still debate. Did the Allies, by trying to punish Germany, did they actually create the conditions that led to World War II? It's complicated. We got to be careful about, judging the past from where we are now. But we got to look at how the choices they made after World War I, especially at that Paris Peace Conference, how those choices shaped things, for decades.
Okay, so let's get to the Treaty of Versailles. Signed right there in that Hall of Mirrors like we were talking about. Had to be an intense moment, all that symbolism, the emotions running high.
Think about it. The German delegation, they had to sign this document, this paper that they saw as totally unfair, a betrayal, Wilson, his 14 points, they felt like they were promised something different. And this treaty, it took away 13% of their land, 10% of their people just gone. And the reparations, crippling, like 269 billion gold marks, that's what, over 400 billion in today's dollars? Their army capped at 100,000 men, navy shrunk way down, no air force allowed. They were basically powerless on the world stage.
There's this quote, I read it. A German official said the treaty could be summed up in one sentence: Germany ceases to exist. Chilling, right? Really shows how humiliated they feel.
Right.
And resentful. So that resentment plus the economic chaos that followed, did that create like the perfect conditions for extremism, for the Nazis to rise up and lead to World War II?
Tough to say for sure, Could a different treaty, one that focused on rebuilding, working together, could that have stopped the Nazis? Maybe. It's something to think about. It's interesting to compare how they treated Germany after World War I to how they treated France after the Napoleonic Wars, way back at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. France, they were actually treated like partners, not enemies.
Wow, that's a huge difference. What do you think explains that? Why treat them so differently?
The winners at Vienna, they knew that Europe needed France to be stable, so they focused on bringing France back into the fold, not crushing them. But with Versailles, it was all about punishing Germany, keeping them down. It came from a place of fear, wanting revenge.
In that approach, that punish them approach, it seems like it backfired, created the very problems they were trying to avoid. It's a reminder that even when you're trying to do good, there can be consequences you don't see coming. But hey, let's talk about Wilson again. He really believed in this new world order, right?
Oh yeah, the League of Nations, his big idea. He really thought it could change things. Prevent future wars, using diplomacy, collective security, a place where countries could work out their problems peacefully.
Pretty ambitious, right? Trying to change how international relations had always worked, power politics and all that.
Yeah.
But the ironic thing is, the U.S., the country that came up with the League of Nations, we never joined.
It's crazy, isn't it? Such a missed opportunity. Political fighting back home, isolationism, partisan stuff. Wilson couldn't get the votes in the Senate to ratify the treaty, the one that created the League. So the country that pushed for this global peace organization wasn't even a member.
Some historians say that's why the League was so weak, why it couldn't stop World War II. They say if the U.S. had been a member, things might have been different. What do you think?
It's hard to say. The League had a lot of problems, not just the U.S. being absent, but it's clear that having America involved would have given it more clout, more resources, made it seem more legitimate. Maybe they could have stood up to those aggressor nations in the 1930s. Maybe things would have played out differently.
It's like a what-if scenario, right?
Yeah.
Makes you think. But it shows how important leadership is. Individual people, the choices they make, the things they do, it can really change history. And we've got to remember the impact of Versailles and the League of Nations on places outside of Europe, too. The Middle East, for example.
Oh, yeah, the Ottoman Empire, it collapsed during the war, left a huge power vacuum in the Middle East. And the winners, Britain and France mostly, they divided up those former Ottoman territories, created these mandates, under the League of Nations.
So they were supposed to govern these areas until they were ready to be independent, right?
Exactly. But the way they drew those borders, they didn't really care about the different ethnic groups, the different religions, and that set the stage for a lot of the conflict that's still going on in the Middle East today.
So these random borders, drawn up by outsiders, they caused all this tension, all this resentment, and it's still going on all these years later.
Yeah, the effects of Versailles, they're still with us in a lot of ways, impacting things in ways that Wilson and those predicted.
And that brings us back to this idea, the past, it never really goes away. It shapes the present. And the choices we make now, they'll have consequences down the road. It's kind of heavy to think about, but it's also empowering, It means we have the power to make choices, to learn from the mistakes they made and try to make things better.
Absolutely. And that's what history is all about. Understanding the past so we can make a better future.
It's those stories, the ones about people being brave, standing up for what's right when everything's going wrong. That's what shows the real human spirit, even in a war.
Yeah. They give us a look into the lives of people history usually forgets about. Their struggles, the good times, the sacrifices they made. Those are the things that connect us to the past. And they remind us that people are tough. The human spirit is strong.
Like the Choctaw code talkers.
Yeah.
Using their language, the Germans couldn't understand them. Helped the Allies win, but nobody really knew about it for years.
Shows you, history's usually told from one side, the winners. So it's up to us to look closer, to find those hidden stories, the ones that were buried or ignored. The stories of the people who were pushed aside, silenced, forgotten.
So for our listeners, if they want to learn more, dig into these untold stories, see things from a different angle, where should they start?
There's so much out there now. Books, websites, you name it. One book I always recommend is Paris, 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World by Margaret Macmillan. It's really well researched, and it's a good read. All about the Paris Peace Conference where they hammered out the Treaty of Versailles. She gets into the personalities, the politics, how all these different countries were trying to get what they wanted. Really fascinating.
And if you want to hear those personal stories, firsthand accounts from the war and after, there are tons of memoirs, letters, diaries written by soldiers, regular people, everyone.
Right. Those are important. Those primary sources, they show you the real cost of war, not just numbers, but what it felt like to be there. The fear, the friendships, the tough times, the hope. There's this one collection, Voices from the Great War, the chronicle of the First World War, told by those who lived it. It's amazing. Letters, diaries, interviews, really takes you back to that time.
Those firsthand accounts, they matter. They remind us that behind all the statistics, the battles on the maps, there were real people living through this, people who suffered, who lost so much. And it makes us think about them, try to understand what they went through and how complicated war is even after it's over.
Yeah, they make history real. It's not just dates and events, it's about people, the choices they made, and what happened because of those choices.
And like we've been talking about, the choices they made after World War I, they had a huge impact, shaped the whole 20th century, even now. The decisions at Versailles, the things they didn't do, the seeds of future conflict, it's all still with us.
The legacy of World War I, it's complicated. It's about loss, but also about people being strong, about new ideas, but also destruction, about hope, and also disappointment. And now, with all the problems we're facing today, it's more important than ever to understand the past, learn from it, and try to create a future where peace and cooperation are the norm.
It's been a really insightful deep dive exploring all this. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us.
My pleasure. And thanks for leading this conversation. It's been great.
So to wrap things up, we hope you keep learning about this time in history. Read those personal stories. Look at things from different angles. Think about what we can learn from it all.
And most importantly, let the stories of the past inspire you to be a force for peace and understanding in the world today. Because in the end, the future isn't set in stone. It's a choice we make every day by what we do or what we don't do.
So let's make good choices. Learn from history so we don't repeat the same mistakes. Let's build a world where peace, justice, and compassion are the most important things. Thanks for joining us. We hope you'll be back for our next deep dive into history.